Hi everyone, Sean here, and welcome to another episode of Lines in Sand. Today I want to do something a little bit different, something a little less formal than usual. This is the 20th episode of Lines in Sand, and it coincides roughly with the channel being online for a year, or it did when I first wrote this script, so I figured it would be fun to do something different and recap some of the mysteries of the Great Pyramid of Giza in a more fun and informal way. Now, if you've spent any amount of time on YouTube in the last few years, there's a fairly high chance that you have come across the format of the iceberg chart. This is a fun way of breaking down a subject in particular, from the most well-known elements floating around on the top of the iceberg down to the very depths of the ocean at the bottom of the iceberg, where the most mysterious, bizarre, alien, or just downright disturbing elements lurk. And of course, there's everything in between. There's nothing too disturbing about the Great Pyramid of Giza, but there are plenty of mysteries about this fascinating structure. And they vary in detail and, well, plausibility and wackiness. So I threw together my own Great Pyramid of Giza mystery iceberg chart. And in today's video, we're going to go through the whole iceberg. I did this recently with my friends and it was a lot of fun, so I figured I could go into much more detail here. A lot of this stuff refers to older videos here on my own channel or to fantastic pieces of work that others have undertaken, be it in video essay form, books, or academic papers and studies. I will link all of these in the video's description, so actually if you're new to the mysteries of the Great Pyramid, this could be a good jumping off point for any particular elements that take your fancy. I will also put a quick disclaimer that this iceberg chart in no way encompasses every single possible mystery or theory about the Great Pyramid. It's just the ones that I could think of off the top of my head as I put together the chart with my friends. So, without further ado then, let's start right at the tip of the iceberg at level 1. Slaves built the pyramids. Now, the pyramid being built by an army of slaves is a very common image, both in media and popular culture references around the pyramid. Any pyramid, to be fair, not just the Great Pyramid, as well as being portrayed in your classic school textbooks and the like. Now, this was because originally it was thought that slaves were indeed used to help build these enormous structures, but more recent evidence discovered by Egyptologists suggests that instead a paid workforce was used in the construction of the pyramids instead. Now, were they paid a salary like we are today? Perhaps not. But more recent discoveries at Giza uncovered the so-called workers' village, or Hayat al-Ghurab, if you'll excuse my pronunciation, which is to the south of the Giza plateau. Here was found the remains of a significant housing settlement, as well as amenities such as butcher shops, breweries, and bakeries and the like. There are various arguments for and against whether the workforce used on the pyramids were voluntary or enslaved. For instance, some say that out-of-season farm workers flocked to such projects where work could not be found elsewhere. But the discovery of this site, just to the south of the Giza Plateau, definitely turned the tide on the default depiction of slavery being used in the construction of these monuments. The pyramids are older than 4,500 years. One of the most common things I hear talked about when it comes to discussing the Great Pyramid and the others on the Giza Plateau is their age. The accepted timeline, as it were, places them around 4,500 years old and belonging to the 4th dynasty Egyptian pharaohs. And that is often contested. Either Thoth or the ancient Sumerians or someone else has some sort of text describing the pyramids as older. Or Graham Hancock put research in one of his books, putting the Sphinx at maybe 12,000 years old or something like that, calling the age of the pyramids around it into question, because the Sphinx was apparently built the same time as the Khafre Pyramid, which is next to the Great Pyramid, or the Pyramid of Khufu. There are more simpler theories, other than all this more should I say, controversial stuff, such as a piece of wood being found inside the Great Pyramid's sealed shaft system, which we will get into a bit later on. But that was carbon dated. It turns out to be 500 years older than the supposed build date of the Great Pyramid. So was that piece of wood used as part of a tool at the correct build date for the Great Pyramid? Or is there some other explanation? Heck, I even read one theory where the Great Pyramid is supposedly 70,000 years old. Now, I'm not saying I believe any of these theories, but the fact that there are so many of them and so often they're spoke about warrants an early entry for this topic at the top of the iceberg. My main issue with a lot of these theories is the same for many other alternative theories surrounding the Great Pyramid, or even the three main pyramids at Giza, is that they do not take into account the countless other pyramids that came before or after them. If you're going to suggest a revision of the timeline for the creation of the 4th dynasty pyramids at Giza, even if you do not necessarily subscribe to the histories of the Egyptian dynasties or consider the pyramids to have belonged to the pharaohs in any way, then there are still a lot more pyramids to be accounted for than just the ones you see every day on the History Channel. You have a lot of constructions there to move around in time, and therefore need a lot more robuster theory, I think, in my opinion. So none that I have seen so far adequately cover this point, but I'm always happy to learn about more different theories, so if I've missed something that does cover all of this, then please point it out to me. Anyway, for the purposes of this entry on the iceberg, the age of the Great Pyramid is approximated to be around 4,500 years old, but as we have discussed, it's widely contested by various people of varying agendas and opinions. If you have heard any convincing arguments for the true age of the pyramids, please feel free to share it with us in the comments, or feel free to share your opinion on the subject. Even better if you have a link to a paper or some sort of research to back up what you're saying. Al-Mamun's Hole. Al-Mamun's Hole, perhaps better referred to as Al-Mamun's Tunnel, is a breach in the north face of the Great Pyramid of Giza, purportedly excavated on the orders of the Caliph Al-Mamun during his time in Egypt during the 8th century. So that's a long time ago. If you've ever been lucky enough to visit the Great Pyramids of Giza, then it is through Al-Mamun's Tunnel that you will enter the pyramid today. And you will only enter the original tunnels of the pyramid when Al-Mamun's excavation intersects with the ascending and descending passageways. The original entrance to the Great Pyramid is a little ways above the tunnel of Al-Mamun, underneath the famous gigantic chevron blocks, and is not accessible, usually, at least to the public. The story goes that during the creation of the tunnel, the men were hacking their way through the core masonry of the pyramid when they heard a stone falling deeper in the pyramid. The men then corrected the course of their digging towards the source of that sound, and then they discovered the joint where the ascending and descending passageways meet. Now, there are several things to call out with this story. What was it that fell and made the sound? Some say it was the casing stone that existed to cover the end granite plugstone where the originally sealed ascending passageway meets the descending one. Personally, for me, it's more of a question of, during all that digging and hacking and horrible working conditions, would the men really have been able to hear a stone falling? On top of that, you've got to wonder what previous knowledge the Caliph Al-Mamun had to instruct his tunnel to be dug in that exact spot, even accounting for the curved change of course, as it were, so the tunnel meets the ascending passageway perfectly. The Caliph even knew more than he let on, or he was extremely, almost incalculably lucky with his guess of where to start digging. Then you've got the fact that the original entrance is not so far away. Even if the intention was to excavate further into the pyramid, surely clearing and extending I mean, therefore destroying the existing tunnel and then attempting to circumnavigate the blocking stones that way. Surely that would have been easier to have used the existing tunnels rather than start afresh at the surface. We also need to take into account that the Caliph's tunnel is also much bigger than the original tunnels constructed inside the pyramid. You can stand to full height inside the robber's tunnel, for example, which begs the question, was the tunnel dug to bring stuff out as well as let people in? There's also the possibility, of course, that the tunnel predates Caliph al-Mamun and that he either took credit for it or has been incorrectly attributed to its creation. I go into this and other breaches into the Great Pyramid in much more detail in my first ever video on this channel, which I will link in the video description below in case you're interested in researching this one further. The NFC. Now, many of you will no doubt recall March 2023's reveal of the incredible NFC, or the North Face Corridor. If you didn't see the news, scientists from the Scan Pyramids project several years earlier proposed using muon scans that a small void existed above the Great Pyramid's original entrance. Then, in 2023, a small fiber optic camera was placed between a gap in the stones, revealing Scan Pyramids to be completely correct in their prediction. Incredible images filled news sites and YouTube channels all around the world. We were seeing this small tunnel for the first time in thousands of years. But Scan Pyramids were not the first to suggest that there may be a void or tunnel in this particular location. I go into this in a bit more detail in my further thoughts on the North Face Corridor video from spring last year, but a more important question is also posed. Why was this tunnel created? Does it lead somewhere? Does it somehow relieve the weight of the pyramid above from bearing down on a descending passage which runs below it? These are questions that are yet to be answered, at least with further investigation into that area, but there are some excellent thoughts circulating on the subject. The YouTube channel History for Granite has an excellent video on the North Face Corridor, which I'd highly recommend to you if you wanted to learn more detail about the void and what it could mean. I will link that in the video description. The Big Void. Now, the Big Void is similar to the North Face Corridor in regards to the fact that it was also discovered, or shall I say proposed, by the studies carried out by the Scan Pyramids project back in 2017. Scan Pyramids proposed both the existence of the North Face Corridor and a more mysterious, far bigger void higher up in the pyramid structure at the same time. This bigger void was aptly named, well, the Big Void. Its size and dimension, both of which are approximate until explorers can somehow reach it and confirm just how big it is, that's if they can even reach it. The location of the supposed Big Void is in such an awkward place in regards to facilitating exploration or even just confirmation that it exists, that we may never be able to confirm that it's actually there, at least in our lifetimes. However, last year's discovery of the North Face Corridor proves that Scan Pyramids' findings are very likely to be extremely accurate. So, what is the purpose of this big void? Why would such a huge room be required so far up into the pyramid? It is, after all, situated higher up than any other chamber or corridor. The closest existing chamber that we know of that's near it is the highest so-called relieving chamber atop the King's Chamber, which is also known as Campbell's Chamber. That being the topmost relieving chamber is known as Campbell's Chamber. Some have proposed that the Big Void is similar to those above the King's Chamber, in that it could be a relieving chamber of sorts protecting the Grand Gallery beneath it. But others have cast doubt on this theory by suggesting that the Big Void is too far away from the Grand Gallery to provide any benefit to this effect. Others have suggested that the Big Void is actually a second Grand Gallery of sorts. Jean-Pierre Houdin, the French architect known for his interesting internal ramp theory, which we will get to a little bit later on, is a supporter of the two Grand Galleries theory and has issued papers to update his own theories, to incorporate a second Grand Gallery. There are finally those who, perhaps quite fancifully and without any real tangible reason or evidence, suggest that this big void may be the final resting place of Pharaoh Khufu, or a room filled with all sorts of immeasurable treasures hidden deep in the superstructure of the pyramid. It's a nice thought, but until the powers that be decide how we explore this big void, that is, if they ever decide to at all, then we will be mulling over this particular puzzle for many years to come. And the final entry then on the first level of the iceberg, which I think are the most talked about things in regards to the pyramid, and the final entry for level 1 is the air shafts. One of the most famous mysteries, easily, of the Great Pyramid is its shaft system. It's one of those things that truly hooked me when I first started looking into pyramids. No other pyramid has them. The minuscule shafts seemingly cut straight from the rock, disappearing from the king and queen's chambers deep into the unknown recesses of the pyramid. And why? What a gigantic, tasty mystery, if there ever was one. In truth, these mind-boggling channels are not cut through the rock, but are cut out of the existing stone before being put into place. There's a very handy diagram on screen right now, which will give you a good example of what a typical section of one of these shafts looks like. The walls and floor are carved out of a lower block, and then another block is placed on top to create the ceiling, as it were. The big question is, of course, why on earth were these shafts created? The man-hours of planning, preparation, installation, it boggles the mind. The King's Chamber, northern shaft in particular, has such a winding route to take around existing constructions inside the pyramid. So why? Why indeed? It seemed that the early prevalent theory was that these shafts were simply air shafts. The immediate question to raise against that proposition is, to what end? These are extremely complex sets of tunnels which would have added massive amounts of time to the construction schedule. It is highly unlikely they would have added them to provide fresher air to workers inside the various chambers. Also, if it's not for the workers, is the air for the pharaoh? If there was a pharaoh buried inside the pyramid, then I'd imagined he'd be well past the desire or need for fresh air. There is then the theory adopted by many Egyptologists, and that is the shafts being ceremonial, ritualistic even, in purpose and design. It is through these shafts that the waters of the Duat flood the chamber and then carry the dead king's soul off to the afterlife. An interesting idea, one that can be backed up by various quotes from ancient texts, but does it hold any water? Pun slightly intended, my apologies. Some eagle-eyed explorers have likened the dummy tunnel in the subterranean chamber deep beneath the pyramid to also mimic this same journey to the afterlife design. If we subscribe to the theory that the pharaoh's burial place may have changed 3 times during the construction of the pyramid, then it makes sense that the evidence of 3 different systems for his journey to the afterlife also existed. This is visible in the tunnel system of the subterranean chamber, as I just said, as of course in the shaft systems of the Queen's Chamber and then the King's Chamber. Then there's the Orion correlation theory, which kind of expands on what we've just talked about, but also ties the pyramid directly to certain stars in the night sky that are vital to the religious aspects of the ascension to the next life. It is a theory that has proliferated over time, but was solidified by Robert Bauval in the 1990s with the help of Adrian Gilbert with their book, The Orion Mystery. I dissect this book and the theories within cover to cover in my in-depth deep dive on the matter, which can be found in the description below if you're interested in diving further down that rabbit hole. But for the sake of this Iceberg video, I will summarize that the Orion correlation theory, like most theories, has numerous issues and unfortunately some inconsistencies. But we're not in total agreement there. Plenty of discourse to be had around that. So, what is it then? Air shafts? Star shafts? The channel History for Granite has a fairly recent video featuring some very new and exciting information about the King's Chamber shafts in particular. I won't spoil it here for you in case you haven't seen it, but it's well worth a watch too if you haven't seen that. I will link that in the video description below. Now, I'm trying to keep it as succinct as possible due to the sheer breadth of information in this video, but it's going to be a long one. We haven't even mentioned the doors at the end of the Queen's Chamber shafts yet, or the fact that the Queen's Chamber shafts don't even reach the outside of the pyramid, and that they stop short by several meters. Truly, the shaft system has baffled many an amateur pyramid enthusiast like myself, and many an Egyptologist, and can, and have no doubt will continue to, spend many hours talking about these things. Truly, the shafts are one of my favorite mysteries of the Great Pyramid, and they are a great way to round out the first level of the iceberg. Now, we're moving on to level 2 of the iceberg, and whereas these things here that I'm going to talk about might not be less popular or less known than the first level of the pyramid, they are a little bit more out there in some regards. And the perfect example of that is the first entry on level 2, and that being the pyramids are not tombs. Yes, one of the most popular alternative theories around the Great Pyramid, or pyramids in general, is that they are not tombs. Detractors of the mainline tomb theory like to state that no bodies have ever been found inside the pyramids. And whilst this is not strictly true, the lack of any intact mummified burial in any of the main pyramids of Giza is mysterious at best. The alternative use cases, then, for these monstrous structures range from simply suggesting that instead the pyramids were some sort of temple or religious monument rather than explicitly a tomb for a pharaoh, to some far more outlandish and unusual propositions, some of which we will touch on in more detail as the video goes on. When it is said that the pyramids are not tombs, it is often in comparison to tombs that were found with intact burials, such as those in the Valley of the Kings. Now, comparisons are made to those intact, colourful burial spaces covered in statues and drawings, diagrams and hieroglyphs depicting all sorts of vivid events and scenarios. It is easy to see that pyramids, especially the Great Pyramid, as sparse, empty, brutal, even industrial in comparison. People view these two things side by side and go, well, if this one's a tomb, that other one simply can't be a tomb. It looks more like a factory. But the appearance of these later tombs, such as the Valley of the Kings tombs, has a lot to do with the time period in which they were made. Sometimes it's easy to forget that ancient Egyptian empires ruled for thousands of years. The people who built the Great Pyramid were a lot different to the people who dug the tomb for Tutankhamun, for example. Over time, the attitudes and process around death changed, and therefore, not only the ritual around death became more expanded and elaborate in some ways, but the way in which tombs were constructed and decorated also changed massively. Now, I'm no expert on this, and this was before we even take into account the demise of the art of pyramid building. This is a mystery in itself and something else altogether. But even as far back as 5th Dynasty pyramids, such as the Pyramid of Unas, hieroglyphic text was placed onto walls in the pyramid's otherwise barren and plain inner chambers. My point is, comparing later tombs to earlier ones, it is not possible to make an accurate comparison and say confidently that the pyramids were not tombs. There is, of course, much more to this, and as with many points on the iceberg chart, we could talk about it all day. Maybe this is a good one for an expanded video at some point in the future. The pyramid was a power plant. Now, this refers to the theory, or shall I say, multiple theories around the pyramid being some sort of power-generating device, rather than a tomb or temple of some kind. This relates a lot to the pyramids are not tombs point that we just discussed, but hones in a bit more specifically by declaring a use case for the structure, a much more utilitarian and functional purpose. I have a video that dives into the various theories out there on pyramid power plants. This includes nuclear pyramids, which is a slightly more obscure take from forgotten papers written many, many moons ago, and of pyramids as chemical processing plants, as popularized by the currently active YouTuber and author Jeff Drum. You can check out his work on the Land of Chem channel if that kind of thing interests you. I do hope to do a deep dive actually, into the land of Chem's propositions here on Lines in Sand at some point in the future, at least those that were put forward in the initial Land of Chem book. Anyway, the most popular power plant theory is, however, written by Chris Dunn and is simply entitled The Giza Power Plant Theory. Dunn addresses the evidence for apparent machine tooling in the ancient world, taking the discussion of how the ancient Egyptians could cut granite blocks and so on with such ease to its extreme. The Egyptians had power tools. Therefore, they had power plants to generate the power for those tools. Surprisingly, as the whole crux of the book hangs on this joint between machine tooling and pyramid power plants, it's never actually explained in the text how the Egyptians used the power that was supposedly created by the Great Pyramid. Dunn, despite this, goes into sometimes preposterous levels of detail whilst proposing how the Great Pyramid acted as a power plant. Each room, corridor, and chamber is accounted for. Nothing is left out. The whole system is quite fantastical and elaborate, but the book glaringly omits how the energy is harnessed once it is blasted out of the pyramid into the wider world. This may feel like a weird point to stick on, but trust me, half the book builds up the evidence of machine tooling in ancient Egypt and then snaps over to the power plant theory. So it's important to me how we propose this energy generated by said pyramid is then utilized by these incredible ancient machines, of which, by the way, there is zero evidence for ever having existed, of course, outside of a few bits of bowls and some personal interpretation of several drill marks. I found investigating pyramid power plants to be a lot of fun, but during my research, I found that the true supporters of such theories to be in the very vocal minority. If you're interested in going down this rabbit hole a bit further, I also have a video that deep dives into Chris Dunn's theory. It's over an hour long, and it leaves no stone unturned. Or is that turned and stoned? As with all the others, it is linked in the description of this video. The internal ramp theory. One of the most popular alternative theories regarding the construction of the Great Pyramid is the internal ramp theory. There has been so much discussion about how a structure such as the Great Pyramid could be put together, how so many blocks, some of incredible size and weight, how they hold up to such great heights. Surely any ramp used in the pyramid's construction would be just as big as the pyramid itself. There is no trace of such a ramp, at least nothing that has been found yet, and this has led many to opine on methods other than the ramp. But what if the ramp used to build the pyramid was hidden inside the pyramid itself? This is the theory perfected by the French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin. Carrying on his father's work in the same vein, Houdin, with the help of Egyptologist Bob Breyer, famously put together the controversial suggestion that the ramp lays hidden inside the pyramid to this very day. Diagrams work best here, I think, so if you're unfamiliar with this theory, take a look at what's on the screen right now. Houdin proposes a kind of angular corkscrew ramp which runs around the outside of the pyramid, whilst the Grand Gallery, a large chamber inside the pyramid, acted as a counterweight system for lifting the heaviest, most enormous granite blocks used in the so-called King's Chamber. The theory has recently been updated with new papers by Houdin, as we mentioned a little bit earlier on, to work in the recent discoveries from the Scanned Pyramids project mentioned at the start of the video. Houdin's internal ramp is one of the few quote-unquote alternative theories concerning the Great Pyramid that I never seem to see getting any serious flack. I think whether the theory is agreed with or not, people just generally seem to have a lot of respect for Houdin in most cases, and he doesn't seem to be put through the meat grinder quite as much as some other alternative theorists. There's also, of course, the possibility that Houdin is onto something very real, but I'll leave that up to you. And before we move on to the next subject on the iceberg, I'll shamelessly drop in a mention here of my own deep dive video on the subject of Houdin's internal ramp theory. A link, as with all the other videos mentioned in this iceberg chart, will be placed in the video description should you be interested in watching further. So the next item on level 2 that I want to talk about is the well shaft. One of the most mysterious features of the Great Pyramid, in my opinion, is the so-called well shaft. It begins at the bottom of the Grand Gallery and is today covered over with a grate or some wooden boards, and from here it descends vertically for the most part, into a route that has been described as tortuous until it terminates at the very bottom of the descending passageway tunnel, just before it levels out and enters the subterranean chamber. Some of the accounts from antiquity describing the earliest explorations of and unblocking of this well shaft are incredible reading. It took a brave soul to go down inside this thing, not knowing where or how it ever ended. It gives me shivers just thinking about it. Not to mention the poor souls that were selected to carve the shaft in the first place during the construction of it. You don't want to fall down this thing, tight and cramped as it may be. On the subject of creating the shaft, how it came to be, or even what its true purpose is unknown, and therefore, of course, widely debated. To complicate things further, the shaft is home to what is known as the grotto, a subterranean excavation that appears to have existed originally inside the natural bedrock before the pyramid was built around it. Remember that the Great Pyramid was built on something of a small hill. Was the well an original feature present before the pyramid was built? Was this existing subterranean excavation incorporated into the pyramid's design? And if so, what then was its purpose? It features across the board in all sorts of theories and in the minds of thinkers when it comes to the pyramid. Some Egyptologists say it was an escape shaft for the workers after the pyramid was finally sealed. But there are problems with how the workers would have sealed the passage on their descent. Chris Dunn says it's a runoff for the chemicals used in running the Giza power plant. What do you think it was for? Because honestly, in a year or so of thoroughly investigating this pyramid, I have absolutely no idea. Much has been said about the well shaft, however, and I will link some further reading and watching in the description of the video if the well shaft has sparked your interest. The Dixon Relics. It was explorer Wayman Dixon who reportedly discovered the shafts that we talked about on level 1 of this video. The shafts leading away from the Queen's Chamber to both the north and the south. So the ones in the King's Chamber were open, and if the ones in the King's Chamber were open and leading away from it, then the Queen's Chamber might have had the same, right? That was Wayman Dixon's thinking, and he was correct. Once the stone was smashed away, revealing the entrances to the Queen's Chamber shafts, Dixon not only unearthed a secondary shaft system inside the Great Pyramid, one that has puzzled Egyptologists and enthusiasts ever since, but he also found trapped inside the shafts several fragments of what appeared to be a tool of some kind. These fragments became known as the Dixon Relics, consisting of a dolerite ball, a copper hook, and a fragment of what appears to be a wooden handle. The relics were quickly extracted from the Great Pyramid for safekeeping. The dolerite ball and the copper hook ended up in the British Museum, but the wood, kept in a cigar box, went missing. Now, I'm not sure if this is a common misconception, but it's a mistake that I certainly made when I first read about this. But the wooden fragments did not immediately go missing upon discovery. I was under the impression that the wooden fragments in the cigar box were lost sometime soon after their discovery in 1872. It was actually not until 1946 when the collection of one Dr. James Grant, who had assisted Wayman Dixon on his expedition to the pyramid, was shipped to the University of Aberdeen. It was during this time, once the collection was shipped to the University of Aberdeen, that was when the cigar box containing the third Dixon relic went AWOL. Now, the significance here, of course, is that wood can be carbon dated. I've read several books written in the 1990s during my research into the pyramid, and the fervour and frustration around attempting to find that third Dixon relic is palpable. In 2001, a record at the University of Aberdeen confirmed that the cigar box should absolutely have been with them as part of the collection of Dr. James Grant. And a search was undertaken to locate the item, but alas, it was not found. It looked like the mysterious cigar box containing the wooden fragment was lost forever, and that was until 2019 when the box was miraculously found, having been mistakenly catalogued into the university's collection of Asian artifacts. It was after all these years, would you believe it? The wooden fragment had split into smaller pieces, but it was able to be safely carbon dated, putting its age at somewhere between 3000 and 3300 BC, which is approximately 500 years or more before the suggested construction date of the Great Pyramid. Now, the significance of this date in relation to the pyramid and what the relics were doing sealed inside one of the pyramid's shafts in the first place, well, all of that is up for debate. An earthquake damaged the pyramid. Or is that earthquakes? Earthquakes are often mentioned when discussing the more particular details around the Great Pyramid. For example, if you look up whilst inside the King's Chamber, you'll see some very worrying looking cracks in the granite ceiling. One theory is that the building has settled over time, with one side of the room settling more than the other, causing the ceiling beam to crack under the pressure. The other theory around this is that an earthquake occurred during construction of the pyramid, near to the end of the project, thereabouts, causing the cracks. This theory also attempts to explain why a tunnel exists to the space above the King's Chamber ceiling, but not to the other chambers above that, and that being for the reason of inspecting the damage in the ceiling to see if any further cracks had occurred. Once it became apparent that only the first ceiling of the King's Chamber had cracks and everything was stable, the tunnel did not continue up into the other chambers. Furthermore, it's often said that the Great Pyramid lost its pyramidion topping stone, as well as much of its white limestone casing stone during earthquakes, or an earthquake maybe, just the one, over the years between then and now, the resulting stone having fallen from the monument and then been pillaged from the ground around it. And the final item then on level 2 of the Great Pyramid Iceberg chart is Khufu's cartouche. One of the main pieces of evidence tying Pharaoh Khufu to the Great Pyramid is the discovery of his cartouche daubed in paint deep inside the pyramid in a chamber above the King's Chamber that was never supposed to be accessed again. This cartouche, which is essentially the pharaoh's name in hieroglyphs, encircled, was painted onto a stone supposedly as graffiti by one of the work gangs who helped construct the pyramid. The cartouche was discovered by the expedition of one Howard Weiss, and many over time have suggested that Weiss either forged or fabricated the cartouche, or at the very least his story and the available facts around its discovery do not add up. It is said that under pressure to come up with something after all his time in Egypt, Weiss faked the whole thing in order to justify the amount of money he had spent on his expeditions at Giza. There is some very controversial evidence where German scientists were able to, perhaps rather dishonestly, obtain a sample of the cartouche and test it. They found that the cartouche was a later addition and not an original painting on the stone deep inside the pyramid, which is pretty damning, but can this evidence be counted? The argument goes on. The YouTube channel Ancient Architects has recently uploaded an excellent feature-length documentary on Khufu's cartouche and the whole Howard Weiss situation, and I'd strongly suggest checking it out for more information on the subject. And that takes us then deeper down into some deeper mysteries of the pyramid, and we are now on level 3 of 5. Things are starting to get a little bit more tasty, a little bit more weird. So stay tuned. The first item on level 3 of the Great Pyramid Iceberg chart is the notch. The notch, from far away at least, looks like the Great Pyramid is missing a piece of its northeastern corner. It's not known how the block shear fell away, but we are not fully privy to the seismic events that have affected Giza over the many centuries since the pyramids were built. What we do know about the notch is that it's a small, flat area where many people like to rest when climbing the pyramid. Not that I'm saying anyone should be climbing the pyramids before anyone gets any ideas, but is there more to this so-called notch? In the television documentary Khufu Revealed, which is about Jean-Pierre Houdin's journey to publish his internal ramp theory, Egyptologist Bob Breyer climbs the Great Pyramid with a cameraman, and we can see the notch in all of its glory. Breyer made this journey because Houdin proposed that the notch was one of the corners of his internal ramp, which had perhaps fallen away with time, and they were looking for any clues that it may reveal. But without going into the theory more than that, what we can always say for sure is that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Bob Breyer found that you could not only enter the interior of the pyramid via the notch, with a small gap between stones allowing you entrance into some smaller, lower hidden chamber. It does not appear that this chamber is an intentional construction, more so some sort of void in the rock of the pyramid, but this has never been confirmed. Breyer was able to see through various cracks or spaces in rocks and peer further down into the core masonry of the pyramid, which begs the question, for me at least, whether there are other notches around the Great Pyramid. However, it is worth noting that scan pyramids calibrated their equipment using the notch, and no other notches have been found during their scans of the rest of the pyramid. The subterranean chamber existed before the Great Pyramid. In most timelines regarding the construction of the Great Pyramid, the so-called subterranean chamber is created first. It acts as Pharaoh Khufu's first burial chamber before grander plans allowed the burial chamber to rise with the pyramid as construction went on, first with the so-called Queen's Chamber and then with the so-called King's Chamber, which is thought to be the final resting place of Pharaoh Khufu. But what if the subterranean chamber existed before the pyramid itself? There is some evidence for this, which I've explored in some greater detail in another video, but I will summarize for the sake of the iceberg chart. You can see in this diagram here where the Great Pyramid was built on what was originally a knoll of some sort. The level at which this original hill exists inside the pyramid is quite interesting. We also have both the so-called well shaft running vertically down, as well as the so-called descending passageway coming in from the north. Now, was the subterranean chamber some previously natural space in the bedrock? Judging from the shape of the path that the well shaft takes, I would say that this is unlikely. But I am just a YouTube creator, not a geologist. A large portion of the descending passageway of the Great Pyramid, however, is cut from the natural bedrock of the Giza Plateau. It is possible, whether true or not, that this subterranean chamber and this mode of accessing it existed before any plans of a pyramid were drawn up. There are those who see the subterranean chamber as a confusing, possibly unfinished mass of partially hewn rock, whilst there are others who see patterns in said rock and propose tomb-like use cases for the chamber that eerily echo similar designs for the chambers that came above in the pyramid substructure, which we have touched on a little earlier in the video. It is very, very unlikely that we will ever find out the chronology of the subterranean chamber, whether it came before, during, or after the Great Pyramid. We are unlikely to ever ascertain, but it is fascinating to think about all the same. Flinders Petrie's head. Flinders Petrie is an individual that we owe a lot to in regards to exploration of the pyramids of Egypt. His expeditions are the stuff of legend, and his works are still referenced today as a benchmark, especially when it comes to measurements and other more precise details in the makeup of these monuments. Petrie lived an interesting life, something that I plan to do a whole video on one day, but at the pace I'm releasing these things, you can expect that in 2026 or beyond. Anyway, eventually Petrie lived into old age and passed away in Jerusalem in 1942. Petrie was laid to rest there, but there was the small matter that he had supposedly donated his brain, including the whole head, to the Royal College of Surgeons in London. Rumour has it, due to complications in getting the brain from Jerusalem to London, due to the ongoing inconvenience, shall we say, that was World War II, Petrie's wife made the perilous journey in person from the Holy Land all the way back to London across war-torn Europe, carrying her husband's severed head in a box. Now, as you can probably imagine, this is simply not true and is one of the more ridiculous mistruths surrounding the pyramids in one way or another. This is such a hot topic that the Wikipedia article on Petrie's life even gives it its own little section titled Death and Preservation of Head. Debbie Shali, again I apologise if I'm butchering that name, addresses this in a blog post on the University College of London website, as does Margaret Drower in her autobiography on Petrie, something which, as I say, we'll be getting into in more detail on the channel in the future. So, if anyone tells you about Petrie's head being carried across Europe by his wife even before, during or after World War II, you can tell them that this little tidbit is in fact untrue. Wile E. Coyote has entered the chat. Now, this refers to the more perhaps gung-ho attitudes of some of the explorers of antiquity, most famously the duo of Howard Weiss and Giovanni Caviglia. Dynamite was often the tool of choice and was an explorative method that has perhaps not aged well. It was a different time, this I am aware of, but the thought of blasting holes in ancient monuments is just crazy to me. For this reason, I've often snuck pictures of Wile E. Coyote into my videos when discussing Vice or Cavilia, because I'm just childish like that, I guess. However, in regards to the Great Pyramid, we need to understand that this somewhat destructive method of exploration has given us some benefits. The most famous is probably access to the so-called relieving chambers above the pyramid's king's chamber. To lesser success, other areas attempted at with explosives include both ends of the King's Chamber northern shaft, as well as the Great Scar in the southern face of the Great Pyramid, which is visible really far away. As I said, all of this is long in the past, and this is just a fun little entry into the iceberg, as I suppose it generally is a part of pyramid history too. However, hopefully we won't be seeing the Egyptian Department of Antiquities dynamiting their way towards the Big Void anytime soon, but stranger things have happened. The Man-Killer Tunnel. This is the very over-the-top name given to an excavation alongside the King's Chamber northern shaft. Where the northern shaft exits the pyramid, a crude tunnel has been dug around the side of it. This tunnel penetrates some way into the pyramid before stopping. Now, as I wrote in my standalone video on the Man-Killer Tunnel, it is quite difficult to find information on said tunnel. Searching online for it doesn't turn up a wealth of information. Since then, Ancient Architects released a standalone video on the Man-Killer Tunnel 2, which contains lots of great information about it, and that's well worth checking out. You could well be thinking as well, as I did when I first heard about this thing, why on earth would someone dig inwards like that from the outermost point of such a narrow and inaccessible shaft? Inaccessible to fully grown humans, at least. Well, the long and short of it is that Wile E. Coyote did it. In this case, it was Giovanni Caviglia who blasted this channel alongside the shaft in search of, I suppose, some sort of secret chamber or explanation for the pyramid's shaft system, which I don't think he ever got, but there we go. Cavities full of sand. In the mid-80s, a team of scientists led by Gilles Domion and Jean-Patrice Goydin, a pair who are always a pleasure to bring up here on the channel because I absolutely butcher their names. They proposed the existence of several cavities alongside the tunnel leading to the Queen's Chamber. Permission was granted for them to drill holes into these supposed chambers and then use further methods to ascertain what was inside. But once the drilling began, it quickly became apparent that these secret rooms were not hidden storerooms full of treasure, but voids within the pyramid that were filled with sand. And not just any sand. After drilling 3 holes in the western wall of the tunnel, it was discovered that the small chambers were filled with quartz sand. This in itself is a mystery. Why is there a chamber here if only to be filled with a pile of sand? And not just cheap everyday Giza sand from the desert outside. No, what was the significance of fetching quartz sand and putting it inside these cavities? A, what is the void itself? B, why is it filled with that type of sand? Are large portions of the pyramid superstructure backfilled with sand? Does it help with moisture issues? Was this simply a chamber that was built and later not used? It seems unlikely at this point that we will ever find out, but stranger things have happened. The Great Step. This is a feature of the Grand Gallery, right at the top of this elongated chamber. Nowadays, the step has been quote-unquote repaired, and more easily negotiable steps have been added to it. We can see from these photos in Keith Hamilton's Layman's Guide to the Great Pyramid what the Great Step looked like before and after. So what's the deal here? Well, there are those that believe that the Great Step never needed to be repaired, that it was in fact supposed to look the way it did, and in quote, repairing it, the authorities have in fact destroyed or covered up clues as to how the Grand Gallery operated. For example, Returning to the author of Level 2's internal ramp theory, Jean-Pierre Houdin, he believes that ropes once ran up the Grand Gallery as the long chamber functioned as a counterweight system for lifting the impossibly heavy granite slabs used in creating the pyramid's king's chamber. This so-called Great Step, then, was the tapered edge through which these ropes were possibly fed. Even if Houdin's theory is incorrect, let's say for example, I personally believe either way, it is likely that the step was supposed to look this way. It is said that the step became damaged over the years, but I fail to see what could have caused such a large chunk of the block to fall away, even in the dynamite happy times of Vice and Cavilla. But due to the work carried out by the authorities, it is likely that we will now never know the true purpose of the so-called Great Step. Crushed beetle shells. When Howard Weiss was exploring the spaces above the King's Chamber, with dynamite of course, he had his men blast a tunnel around the granite in order to access the second of the so-called relieving chambers, which he named Wellington's Chamber. Now, the ceilings of these things, or the floors of them, are made of huge granite blocks, and digging through them was virtually impossible, so they blasted around them. Anyway, there was something strange about Wellington's chamber. Anyone who went in there came out covered in a strange black substance. This turned out to be a thick layer of black powder consisting of the shells of bodies of decaying insects such as beetles. Now, the second relieving chamber was the only chamber discovered to be found full of this black powder. All the other chambers did not have it. Let's not forget also, we're deep inside the pyramid at this point. How likely is it that insects got in this far, all congregated and died in this area? If that's not particularly likely, then we have to think about why someone would put all of this ground up insect dust all over the granite stones and in this chamber only. Why would this have been done? Unfortunately, none of this black, mysterious beetle powder has been preserved, making any testing absolutely impossible. I'm going to put this one to the audience then. Why do you think the second relieving chamber above the King's Chamber was full of crushed beetle shells? Definitely, this is one of the stranger organic mysteries of the Great Pyramid, outside of some of the wackier theories and ideas we'll get into a little later on. Damaged walls. When entering the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, the wall right in front of you is significantly damaged. This is the south wall, and it houses the southern shaft, which goes off into the pyramid and terminates at the southern face of the pyramid. But there is some interesting scarring on this wall inside the King's Chamber, as well as the opening to the southern shaft being significantly wider. Some say that an explosion of sorts happened inside the Great Pyramid. Of course, there is no evidence for this. What kind of explosion could there have been? We could also look at the previously mentioned arguments for the damage to the King's Chamber ceiling, those being subsidence and earthquakes. Are either of these responsible also for the damage to the southern King's Chamber wall? Could our dynamite-wielding explorer friends have caused this damage to the wall? This is another mystery left unanswered, for now at least on level 3, but the scarring on the wall is a distinct feature of the granite-clad room that is the King's Chamber. And on this lightning-fast level 3 of these slightly more unanswerable mysteries, we have, I think, probably one of the most perplexing things about the Great Pyramid, and that is Gantenbrink's door. Now, this is the name given to the so-called door found at the end of the Queen's Chamber southern shaft. It's now confirmed that a similar door exists at the end of the Queen's Chamber northern shaft, but in 1993, when Gantenbrink first arrived with his shaft-crawling robot, U-Boat, his team could not get the robot to ascend the northern shaft, but the discovery of the door at the end of the southern shaft caused quite a stir at the time. There was a lot of speculation about what the door could be hiding, but it wasn't until a National Geographic project in 2002 that further explored the tunnels using another robot. They drilled a hole through this so-called Gantenbrink's door, and once again in 2010 there was the JEDI project, whose robot re-explored once again the Queen's Chamber shafts and placed a flexible camera through the hole that the National Geographic team had made in Gantenbrink's door, allowing for far better images to be captured captured of what was beyond. This was also quite a big event at the time, and I'm sure whilst plenty of people were disappointed with every peek behind the shaft doors, as all that was revealed was a small extension to the tunnel, and then the possible real end of the tunnel was in sight. If that is the case, then why bother with these doors in the first place? There's also the fact that there are copper pins in Gantenbrink's doors. What is the significance of these additions? Some say they were used as hooks, to lower the shaft door into the shaft before it was closed up during construction. Others say that the copper pins resemble, in size and shape, electrodes, which is a bit more out there. One thing for sure, and that is the existence of Gantenbrink's doors only extended the mystery and fascination with the Great Pyramid's shaft system, which is complicated and fascinating enough without the existence of mysterious doors blocking their ends, at least in the Queen's Chamber shaft. Fanfare around the true purpose of these doors has mostly died off, but there are many out there who still clamour for an answer to this tantalizing mystery. And that takes us nicely into level 4 of the Iceberg chart. And the first entry on this level of the Iceberg chart is related somewhat to the previous one we were just talking about. And that is the King's Chamber shafts were sealed too. Now, this is something very interesting to think about, and that is the very recent proposition that the King's Chamber shaft entrances, or exits, into the chamber itself were originally sealed, just like those in the Queen's Chamber. The shafts of the Queen's Chamber were quite famously broken open by Waymond Dixon in the 18th century when he was exploring the Great Pyramid, but there are no records of this having taken place in the King's Chamber. The shafts there have always known to have been open as they are today. Now, I won't spoil it too much because there's a ton of work that's gone into the video, but History for Granite proposes that the King's Chamber shafts were sealed too, and he presents some compelling evidence to support this case. I'd highly recommend checking out the full video, which I have linked in the description below. The Second Grand Gallery. You'll remember all the way back at level 1 of the Iceberg, we covered the recently discovered Big Void. Again, just to briefly recap, it is not possible to reach this potential chamber yet, and we only know about it due to the muon scans performed by the Scan Pyramids team. There have been many theories proposed as to what function this so-called Big Void could fill, but interestingly, Jean-Pierre Houdin, again the author of the internal ramp theory we touched on back in level 2 of the Iceberg, suggests that the Big Void strengthens parts of his theory of an internal ramp. He suggests that the Big Void could actually be a second Grand Gallery higher up in the pyramid. Houdin proposes in the internal ramp theory that the so-called Grand Gallery was actually a counterweight system that was used to lift the heaviest blocks during the pyramid's construction. Houdin created detailed models of this counterweight system at work, and they are fascinating to say the least. The prospect of another similar system existing further up in the pyramid superstructure actually makes a lot of sense. A lot of granite is used above the King's Chamber to create the so-called relieving chambers. And these blocks are ginormous to the point where it really boggles the mind as to how they were ever lifted into place. Recently, Houdin has published what could be considered as supplemental papers to his internal ramp theory that address the Big Void and the possibility of a second Grand Gallery. I will link these papers in the description of the video. The Iron Plate. Remember back in level 3 when we spoke about the Man-Killer Tunnel? Well, the northern shaft entrance, where that tunnel begins, was not the only King's Chamber shaft to suffer at the hands of dynamite-toting explorers. Yes, the mouth of the southern shaft was also cleared by the use of dynamite. It was during that clearing exercise that an iron plate was found lodged in the opening of the shaft. This led to all manner of speculation, again, at the hands of Howard Weiss, or at least in this case, men within his expedition. It was claimed that gold-plated doors of iron may have once covered the exits to the shaft systems. This is a fantastic claim because it puts the chronology of metallurgy into question. Iron, outside of relics made of meteoric iron, was not workable by the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians had, perhaps quite famously, copper tools, but did not learn how to work iron until over 1,000 years later, in approximately 1200 BC. So where did this piece of iron come from? Chances are it was some debris that was blasted into its discovered place wedged between two stones. Let's not forget the overuse of dynamite in exploring the pyramid. Tests ran on the composition of the iron plate by the British Museum in 1993 confirmed that no trace of gold was found in the plate's composition. The jury may be out on this one, but it's looking somewhat unlikely that doors of iron and gold once stood at the ends of the shafts. I have a full video on this subject if you are interested, though, in diving deeper on this mystery. The niche. This is a very peculiar construction inside the Great Pyramid's Queen's Chamber. There is a picture of it on screen right now. Its existence alone perhaps does not warrant a place this far down an iceberg chart, as it is an original feature of the pyramid and is quite hard to miss. Its significance has not been lost, however, on explorers and treasure hunters, and some of their actions around this so-called niche has further deepened the mystery around it. A common explanation for the existence of the niche is that it functioned as a serdab. This is where a statue of the deceased pharaoh would have been placed. However, there are those who, whilst perhaps do not have concrete answers as to why the ancient Egyptians took the time to construct this niche in such a way, they do take its presence as some sort of clue for perhaps further investigation being warranted into the area. Howard Weiss, who we've mentioned now multiple times in this video, famously dug up the Queen's Chamber floor, and in front of the niche they supposedly found an old wooden basket. Where this basket is, or if it could have been carbon dated, I do not know. It does beg the question, however, whether Weiss was the first person to go digging in this area in search of treasure or tombs. Maybe there had been those there before him. As well as this, if we look inside the niche, there is a short tunnel of sorts here, created purposefully out of limestone blocks. I hope the diagram I have on screen does it justice, but you can see why perhaps people were drawn to this weird part of the pyramid. Why is there a small tunnel constructed here? Some of the limestone blocks used in its construction too are particularly huge. It is perhaps of little to no surprise then that unnamed robbers or explorers from centuries past attempted to continue on where this tunnel stopped, excavating further a rough-hewn tunnel into the core masonry. As you can see from the diagram on screen, this went a ways into the core masonry of the pyramid, where the diggers either found what they were looking for or gave up and turned around. Personally, I would say that the former is extremely unlikely and that the diggers just called it a day. Ancient Architects has an excellent video discussing the details of the niche and this tunnel behind it, as well as a video about the digging up of the Queen's Chamber floor, and I will link these in the video description. The Great Pit. Deep beneath the Great Pyramid, in the so-called subterranean chamber, is the Great Pit, an imposing excavation in the rock which, due to the darkness of the cavern, can sometimes look bottomless, or at least far deeper than it actually is. But why is it there? These days it seems like a giant hunk of granite has been thrown down it, also for reasons beyond my comprehension. The pit has been the subject of much theorizing, from fitting part of a mock tomb plan to being the source of the original pump or spring that fed the Giza power plant. The Great Pit is another intriguing part of the already mysterious subterranean chamber. As this is a fairly short section of the video, I'll once again put it to the audience. What do you think is the significance of the Great Pit? Answers on a postcard. And the final entry then, on level 4 of my iceberg of Great Pyramid mysteries, is the secret tunnels beneath the pyramid and the Giza Plateau in general. I couldn't round off this video with the extra conspiratorial level 5 without first mentioning the very real labyrinth of supposed secret tunnels beneath the Great Pyramid and the Giza Plateau in general. Summarizing this in a paragraph or so is quite difficult, as these tunnels are supposedly numerous. I've yet to really study them myself, but points of interest include the so-called Tomb of the Birds, the Osiris Shaft, and the resting place of the favoured ones, as well as other tunnels which remain flooded and apparently inaccessible. I do hope to do more work of my own on these tunnels, because I can't make sense currently in my head of how they all connect, if they even connect at all, and what their significance is in regards to the Great Pyramid. But they get brought up quite a lot. For now, if you are interested in these secret tunnels beneath the pyramids and the Sphinx and so on, you can check out the works of Andrew Collins, Larry Powell, and Kathy Forty. I will link some of their stuff in the video description. On that note, let us descend fully into the underworld of the Iceberg, at least, with a trip to the entries that I have reserved for level 5 of the Iceberg, the bottommost level. Yes. Secret tunnels, then, above the King's Chamber. In the year of 1997, acoustics engineer Tom Danley, who was working on acoustic tests for a TV documentary, spotted what he believed to be signs of clandestine digging taking place in what is known as Davidson's Chamber, which is the first narrow chamber above the ceiling of the Great Pyramid's King's Chamber. That's the one chamber below the one that had all the bug dust in it that we spoke about a little earlier on. You could take a quick look at the diagram on screen to get an idea of where the supposed digging was taking place. This secret digging sparked something of a small international outrage, where researchers came to Egypt to challenge Zahi Hawass and the government on the evidence that had been seen by Tom Danley. It was speculated that the Egyptian government were perhaps secretly trying to reach the back of Gantenbrink's door by digging a small tunnel, as indicated on the on-screen diagram, with the purpose of reaching any supposed chamber that may have existed behind the door. We know now, of course, that it's no longer the 1990s and the doors have been opened. All that exists behind the doors at the end of the Queen's Chamber shafts is just a strange cavity. I have a separate video that covers all of this secret tunneling business in more detail. And there's a great comment on there from Doug from History for Granite, which is a great summary for all those left wondering, as I was, as to what the heck was actually going on in the tunnels above the King's Chamber. The TLDR version, then, for those who just want to know the cold hard facts, I'll quote straight from Doug. No conspiracy, just incompetence. A second set of funerary tunnels. Now, this is one of my favourite theories about the Great Pyramid. What we see today in the Great Pyramid are perhaps just the service tunnels, it's proposed, and that a second set of tunnels, still sealed and hidden from us, existed, most often it is proposed, for the funeral procession of Pharaoh Khufu's sarcophagus into its resting place in the King's Chamber. These tunnels are often speculated to have begun around the original entrance, near the descending passage entrance, and then to terminate either at the bottom end of the Grand Gallery or, more fantastically and tantalizingly, through a series of additional chambers terminating directly in the King's Chamber through a secret wall. Now, this all sounds absolutely preposterous, I know, but there are those in the field who are very respectable who have given these kinds of theories plenty of coverage. Once again, Ancient Architects has excellently researched videos on this matter, and I will link them in the description, but also Jean-Pierre, author of the Internal Ramp Theory, who we have mentioned multiple times in this video today, is a name who for a time greatly advocated for the existence of such tunnels. It's a bit different in more recent years, as the Scan Pyramids work has seemingly revealed all that it's ever going to reveal, at least with the current technology. There's always the possibility that the tunnels have been backfilled or are too small to show up on the scans, but this would put the more fantastical path proposed to the King's Chamber I suppose, to bed. I'll try and get some diagrams and put them on the screen to show you what I'm referring to here. It's unlikely that chambers of these sizes were not going to show up on the scanned pyramids fields of investigations. On the other hand, discovery and confirmation of the North Face corridor in 2023 sparked interest back up in these kinds of theories, what with a lot of people wondering just where the tunnel may lead. People have also proposed in the past the presence of a tunnel here, so when it was confirmed to be a passage right there, the North Face corridor, even though we don't currently know what it's for, you can imagine the excitement of that discovery, getting the wheels and cogs in people's minds turning again. I'd like to do more on these possible secondary tunnels here on the channel, but realistically, I also want to be moving away from my laser focus on the Great Pyramid. There's so much about ancient Egypt we are missing out on by focusing exclusively on the Great Pyramid, but it's such an enigma that you can't help but really keep coming back to it. Anyway, on to the next entry in level 5 of the Great Pyramid, Mystery Iceberg, and that is the secret tomb of King Khufu. There is supposedly always the possibility that Pharaoh Khufu's tomb still exists somewhere inside the Great Pyramid. This is looking more and more unlikely, what with the recent work by Scanned Pyramids not showing us anything of interest outside of the North Face corridor and the Big Void. In fact, to be honest, there has been no real evidence at all for any other chamber deep inside the pyramid core. Even wilder theories, such as secondary sets of funerary tunnels like we just talked about, and the like, they always harken back to existing chambers that we already know about. These tunnels are perhaps too small to show up on the scans performed by Scanned Pyramids, so there is a chance, however small, that further tunnels could exist. But further burial chambers, like I just said about the funerary tunnels, further burial chambers containing the king and all of his riches, that's a bit more unlikely. I've placed this one down on tier 5 of the iceberg because despite there having never been any evidence to suggest that there may be a secret chamber containing the pharaoh yet to be uncovered in the pyramid, it is none other than Zahi Hawass who often perpetuates this possibility. Still, to this day, he does this. But why? He has fantastically claimed that Khufu could still be found in the pyramid at several key moments over the years. When the National Geographic team were filmed when they drilled through Gantenbrig's door just after the new millennium, Hawass was there, sweating profusely inside the chamber and claiming wildly that Khufu could still be behind further doors inside the shafts. Likewise, with the press conference around the discovery of the North Face corridor in March 2023, Hawass was there in front of the world's media proclaiming that the North Face corridor must be a relieving chamber that is protecting something beneath it, something that he wildly and without any evidence to back himself up with claims he is sure to be the tomb of Pharaoh Khufu. Why would they put Khufu right by the door of the pyramid? It would be the easiest and most probable answer to suggest Hawass is saying these possibly absurd things in order to drum up interest in the Great Pyramid and to keep its potential undiscovered secrets fresh in the minds of would-be tourists. This seems to go against the grain in that the Egyptian government sanctions explorations and studies of the pyramids at the glacial pace of a cryogenically frozen snail, but it is the most likely answer. But Khufu could still be in the pyramid somewhere. Let's not write it off completely. Burial beneath the king's chamber. Speaking of secret tombs still existing inside the pyramid, a slightly different tangent, but one that there is some circumstantial evidence for, is that for the possibility of some sort of chamber existing beneath the floor of the king's chamber. Now, this is a bit of a strange one, as it's an incredibly unusual and inconvenient place to put a chamber, but it only takes a few minutes of studying the Great Pyramid to realize that the entire structure is incredibly unusual and inconvenient. If you want to know more about this entry, this short entry into the iceberg, then there is once again an excellent ancient architects video that addresses it, which I will link for you all to check out if you want to learn more about this one. And finally then, getting right to the bottom of level 5, let's talk about some really strange stuff. Ark of the Covenant. Yes, this refers to the various conspiracy theories that exist to propose that the Ark of the Covenant came from within the Great Pyramid, or was originally stored inside the Great Pyramid and has since been stolen or removed and taken to another place. It's hard to get a concrete summary for this one, purely because it's very wishy-washy, but it's something I've seen that comes up a few times in my research that has taken me off the beaten path, so to speak. The general idea is that the Great Pyramid was built to house the Ark of the Covenant and maybe embrace or unleash its powers rather than any boring old dead pharaoh. There is, of course, absolutely zero evidence for any of this, and it's a pretty out there theory, hence its place at the bottom of level 5 of the Iceberg. And the final entry. It's also another one of those theories, much like Chris Dunn's Giza power plant or Robert Bauval's star shaft theory, is that it gets tunnel vision on the Great Pyramid only. I mentioned this at the beginning of this rather long video. This is one of those theories that gets sucked into the black hole of the Great Pyramid and doesn't take the surrounding necropolis into account. What about the other pyramids? Even if we count the 3 at Giza and not the numerous others across Egypt, what? Was there a separate ark in all 3 pyramids? Did they power other mystical lost artifacts? You can see why this one is a bit daft. Maybe the Great Pyramid was a power plant or a vessel to hold the Ark of the Covenant, but all the others were tombs. Come on, it makes no sense. Maybe I've just not reached the right material yet, and there is a sensible level-headed discourse or paper out there somewhere on this subject, but there's so much to investigate in regards to these pyramids in ancient Egypt. Maybe this one is something for the back burner right now. And the final entry then into my iceberg chart. Again, I just put this chart together as a bit of fun, so I may have missed some cool mysteries. If I have, please let me know. This is the final mystery on the chart, and it is the proposition that the pyramid was a dielectric, lightning-powered acoustic sonochemical catalyst chemical reactor that produced sulfuric acid for the strategic leach mining of metallic ore deposits on the Giza Plateau. Yeah, that's right. The pyramid was a dielectric, lightning-powered, acoustic sonochemical catalyst chemical reactor that produced sulfuric acid for the strategic leach mining of metallic ore deposits on the Giza Plateau. This is kind of a comedic final entry into the iceberg, because I don't really have any in-depth explanation for this one. Only I know that it's part of the wider land of chem viewpoint that the ancient monuments in Egypt are supposedly almost like factories for the mass production of various chemicals responsible for Egypt's prosperity, growth, and success, such as fertilizers, paints, dyes, and what have you. I've not watched every video that Land of Chem has done, not by a long shot, but I see Land of Chem like a more widespread and thought-out variation to the Giza power plant theory. And if that kind of thing interests you, then by all means check out the Land of Chem channel or book. And on that bombshell, we bring the Great Pyramid iceberg chart to a close. I hope this video has given you something to think about, and perhaps some rabbit holes to go down, or even some subjects to reinvestigate. There are plenty of additional links and sources relating to just about everything we've talked about today in the video description. To my regular viewers, I apologize for the delay in getting a new video out. As I said in a previous community post, my partner recently gave birth to our second child, so it's been all hands on deck in real life, as it were, and not much time left for drifting away to investigate ancient Egypt. I'm mentioning this again because truly, I don't know how much reach the community posts that I do on YouTube have. In my case, I don't suspect it reaches very far at all. Anyway, I promise that a more normal video release schedule should resume slowly over the next few months. At least I do not want any more several month-long gaps if I can help it. There's a lot in the pipe that I'm desperate to get out and published, and I need to get through the backlog. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this slightly less formal journey into the mysteries of the Great Pyramid, and as always, I welcome any and all friendly discourse in the comment section. It'll be nice to hear from you after some time away. For now, that's me signing off again. I'll catch you in another video. Take care out there, and bye for now from Lines in Sand.